In the spring of 1845, the British Admiralty launched what it considered one of the most ambitious exploratory missions of its era. Its objective was simple in writing, but immensely complex in execution: to locate and cross the final uncharted sections of the Northwest Passage, a shipping route across the Arctic that could connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Command of the expedition was assigned to Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old Royal Navy officer with extensive polar experience. He had served in earlier Arctic expeditions decades before, so he had not commanded one in many years. Despite his age and some earlier failures, he was respected and became the symbolic leader of this final push. The mission would be executed with two ships: HMS Erebus, commanded by Captain James Fitzjames, and HMS Terror, commanded by Francis Crozier, a seasoned Irish officer with substantial Arctic experience. Both ships were former bomb vessels adapted for polar exploration. They were heavily reinforced with iron plating on the hulls to withstand ice pressure. Their steam engines were retrofitted using parts from old locomotives to provide auxiliary propulsion when wind was insufficient. The Admiralty also equipped them with the latest available technology, including heated living quarters and provisions designed to last at least 3 years. The expedition carried approximately 129 men, including officers, sailors, engineers, and ice pilots. The crew was carefully selected based on their health, technical skills, and discipline. The Admiralty had spent decades trying to complete the Northwest Passage. While much of the Arctic coastline had been mapped by earlier explorers, large sections remained unknown. The Franklin expedition was designed to fill those gaps. Before departure, the ships were stocked with more than 8,000 tins of preserved food, over 10,000 kilograms of salted meat, and barrels of water and alcohol. They also carried equipment for scientific observations, surveying instruments, sleds, and even a library of over 1,200 books for morale and education during the long polar winters. Officers wrote that they were confident their mission would be successful. An expectation existed in London that the expedition might complete its objective in only 1 or 2 sailing seasons. The two ships departed from Greenhive, England on 19 May 1845. They sailed through the Thames estuary toward the North Atlantic and made their final sighting by civilian vessels in Baffin Bay in late July. Whalers reported that both ships were in excellent condition and sailing well. Franklin's letters expressed optimism and thanked the Admiralty for its support. From that point on, the expedition vanished from known maritime routes and was uncontactable. Under the standard practices of the time, Arctic expeditions were not expected to communicate regularly, so no immediate concern was raised. Before departure, the ships had been thoroughly examined. The living spaces were heated by steam to prevent frost damage and to reduce scurvy risk. The officers had access to better accommodations, but the entire crew expected hardship. Medical supplies were supervised by the ship's surgeon, Dr. Stephen Stanley for Erebus, and Dr. Henry Goodser for Terror. The medical plans included prevention strategies for cold exposure, scurvy, and mental health challenges caused by isolation. However, tin can preservation methods were not properly tested. Historians later suggested that the solder used in the cans was improperly sealed, and possible lead contamination might have affected crew health later. Throughout August 1845, Franklin's expedition pushed westward into Lancaster Sound. It was the primary route toward the interior of the Arctic. The ships planned to winter at a safe location and continue the next summer. Franklin's orders indicated he should proceed through to the Beaufort Sea and eventually reach the Pacific via the Bering Strait. During that first navigational season, conditions were relatively favorable. Ice concentration was lower than average for the period, and the ships made slow but steady progress. The crews conducted routine surveys, took meteorological measurements, and collected samples for natural history research. By September 1845, ice began forming rapidly, and the ships prepared for the first winter. According to later Inuit accounts, the two ships were seen entering a sheltered bay in Yurbiki Island. Here, they remained stationary through the winter of 1845 to 1846. During that time, the crew remained disciplined. Officers maintained activity schedules, religious services, study periods, and moderate exercise. Franklin followed naval routines to sustain structure. In spring 1846, 3 crew members died. These deaths were recorded in a document later discovered at Beakey Island by search parties. The grave sites indicated the deceased were John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain, young men aged between 20 and 32. No cause of death was officially cited, but later examinations suggested possible pneumonia or complications from malnutrition. Importantly, Franklin did not record any major expedition-wide problems at that point, and the expedition continued. After ice melted in summer 1846, HMS Erebus and Terror weighed anchor and resumed their westward journey. They passed Barrow Strait and headed into Peel Sound before turning south towards Victoria Strait. This decision would prove critical. The navigational charts they relied on were based primarily on assumptions and incomplete surveys. Franklin aimed to find a direct route through the ice toward King William Island. Meteorological data from that year indicates that the summer of 1846 was colder than average, with unusually high ice density. Progress slowed dramatically. By September 1846, the ships became trapped in multi-year pack ice west of King William Island. This time, they were unable to free themselves. Franklin ordered preparations to overwinter again, expecting that they could continue the next season. The location was remote and exposed to severe ice pressure. Records later recovered indicate that the ships remained locked in ice through the entire winter of 1846 to 1847. The crew carried out maintenance, rationed food, and scheduled sled training in case land expeditions became necessary. During this second winter, health began deteriorating more seriously. Symptoms reported by later analysis included potential scurvy, lead poisoning, and respiratory illnesses from poor ventilation and coal burning. Morale remained stable initially due to Franklin's leadership, but uncertainty increased. In June 1847, Sir John Franklin died at the age of 61. His death was recorded in an official document, though the cause was not explicitly mentioned. Command transferred to Captain Francis Crozier, who was regarded as more experienced in polar navigation. Crozier decided to wait for the ice to melt before making major movements. Despite waiting, the ice did not fully release the ships during summer 1847. The expedition remained immobilized. Supplies were still relatively adequate, but disease and cold conditions worsened. Crozier documented plans for possible abandonment if the ice did not release by 1848. Officers conducted initial surveys of the surrounding land, mapping coastlines and seeking possible escape routes toward the Canadian mainland. By the beginning of 1848, it became evident that the ships would not be freed. Examining the geographic context, King William Island lies within one of the most ice-choked areas of the Arctic. Historical data confirms that the area often remains blocked even in summer. Crozier ordered preparations to abandon the ships and proceed south on foot, dragging sleds. The official record indicating this decision was found later by a search party in 1859 at a cairn west of King William Island. The record states that on April 22, 1848, HMS Erebus and Terror were still trapped in ice. At that point, 105 men remained from the original 129. They planned to march toward the Back River with hopes of reaching settlements near the Hudson Bay Company trading posts. The document was signed by Crozier and Fitzjames. It marked the last known written communication from the expedition. From there, the exact fate of the remaining crew became subject to speculation. Search expeditions launched years later by the Admiralty and American explorers uncovered material evidence of camps, equipment, and human remains along the route. Inuit accounts described abandoned ships, groups of starving men traveling south, and reports of extreme physical deterioration.
On April 22, 1848, leadership of the remaining Franklin expedition members transferred fully to Captain Francis Crozier after the death of Sir John Franklin the previous June. By that point, both ships, HMS Erebus and Terror, remained immobilized and thick polarized roughly 15 miles off the western coast of King William Island. According to the official naval records stored in a cairn by the crew, 105 men were still alive from the original complement of 129. The shipbound environment had become unsustainable due to worsening health conditions, dwindling food quality, and continued inability to navigate free waters. Crozier ordered full abandonment preparation. The decision to evacuate the ships was military in structure. Men were assigned into hauling parties, each responsible for dragging heavy sledges loaded with remaining provisions, navigational instruments, tents, medicine chests, and boats repurposed as mobile platforms to help cross frozen channels. The route selected aimed to follow the western coastline of King William Island, eventually reaching the mouth of the Back River on the Canadian mainland. From there, they hoped to access Hudson's Bay Company trading outposts and possibly encounter whaling ships. This was the only viable survival prospect remaining. The men began their overland journey between late April and early May 1848. Historical analysis confirms this departure phase based on campsite remains and Inuk testimony. The average sledge weight exceeded 400 kilograms, requiring more than a dozen men per unit to transport. Weather conditions during that time were severe, with temperatures frequently dropping below -20 degrees Celsius and winds intensifying exposure. The crew had limited cold weather mobility training, and their clothing, though winter-rated by Victorian standards, was insufficient for sustained physical labor in Arctic temperatures. The march proceeded slowly. Progress was frequently interrupted by sickness, fatigue, and terrain obstacles. The coastline was jagged, alternating between ridge ice field and areas where meltwater pooled, forcing detours. Men began displaying symptoms consistent with scurvy, including muscle weakness, bleeding gums, and impaired coordination. The prevalence of lead poisoning, later confirmed by forensic studies on human remains recovered along the route, likely impaired cognitive judgment as well, affecting the ability to make cohesive survival decisions. Medical officers attempted to maintain health protocols but were limited by supplies. They provided doses of lemon juice and herbal remedies preserved aboard the ships, but prolonged consumption of processed rations, particularly tinned food, had already deteriorated their condition. Observations documented decades later suggested that some men may have experienced hallucinations or disorientation associated with heavy metal toxicity and hypothermia. By mid-May 1848, the expedition had established multiple temporary camps along the western coast of King William Island. Findings from modern archaeological surveys suggest that the groups fragmented into smaller detachments, possibly due to disagreements on strategy or inability of weaker members to maintain marching pace. Inuit oral histories described observing men hauling sledges in lines, many appearing thin, weak, and desperate. The crew attempted to navigate toward O'Reilly Island, an intermediate landmass near the Adelaide Peninsula. Evidence suggests that one detachment remained near King William Island while another pressed southward. During this period, fatalities increased. Survival rates depended on physical strength and officer management. Crozier attempted to maintain command structure but was increasingly reliant on senior officers like Fitzjames. The lack of ammunition also limited hunting capabilities, and sightings of seals or caribou were infrequent along this route. Inward reports from the region, collected from the late 19th century onward, consistently describe encounters with small groups of foreign men in odd clothing. These accounts mentioned that some were carrying guns but lacked functional ammunition and appeared hesitant or unable to use them effectively. They were observed attempting to gather dry wood for fires. The wood supplies were scarce. Some were reportedly seen boiling bone stocks, likely from onboard preserved meat stocks, illustrating severe nutritional deficiency. In June 1848, it is likely that the remaining men reached the vicinity of the Back River, though exact numbers are unclear. Archaeological investigations located artifacts including boots, fragments of sledges, and remains associated with naval uniforms. No comprehensive written journal covering this phase was found, indicating that record-keeping was deprioritized in favor of survival activity. From this point, survival prospects diminished further. The Back River region is one of the harshest in the Arctic, with little shelter and minimal vegetation.
Several contemporary historians estimate that by late summer 1848, most expedition members had died from exposure, starvation, and illness. However, evidence suggests that limited numbers may have attempted continued relocation. During 1850, further search expeditions by British and American teams encountered traces of abandoned camps north of the Back River, on King William Island, and on mainland coastlines. One of the most significant discoveries was made by the McClintock search expedition in 1859, commanded by Francis Leopold McClintock aboard HMS Fox. His team located a document in a cairn which contained the final message written by Crozier and Fitzjames. This brief note confirmed Franklin's death, the icebound status of both ships, and the abandonment orders. It made no further reference to events during the overland journey. The McClintock team also encountered Inuit residents who provided stories of groups of weak, starving men traveling south, some dragging sledges, others falling behind. They described finding bodies and even reported that some men resorted to extreme measures to survive. In later 20th century forensic studies, cut marks on recovered bone fragments suggested possible cannibalism among the final survivors. While unsettling, most historians accept that such actions may have occurred in extreme conditions, though the expedition records did not document this directly. A significant physical remnant of the Franklin expedition was located in 2014 and 2016 when Canadian underwater archaeological teams discovered the wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror at the bottom of Victoria Strait and Terror Bay, respectively. The Erebus lies approximately 11 meters underwater, well preserved due to cold conditions. The Terror is found further south, in almost pristine condition, suggesting it may have remained afloat longer before sinking. The layout indicates that at some point, crew members may have returned to the ships, possibly seeking shelter during the march or post-abandonment. These finds confirm that abandonment and potential reboarding were separate events. Analysis of ship interiors revealed that personal items were neatly stowed, indicating initial evacuation was carried out with discipline. The presence of personal belongings, officer journals, and meals likely prepared shortly before departure supports the theory that abandonment was not chaotic, but strategically planned. Climate reconstructions indicate that the Arctic experienced a particularly cold phase during the 1840s, part of a broader climatic downturn known as the Little Ice Age's final phase, which could have intensified the ice conditions trapping the vessels. Despite the overwhelming loss of life, the expedition contributed indirectly to Arctic knowledge. Numerous subsequent searches, including those led by Sir John Rae and McClintock, significantly improved cartographic understanding of the Canadian Arctic. Records associated with Franklin's mission were added posthumously to Admiralty navigation archives. Crozier is recognized for having made logical survival decisions with limited resources, though some historians argue that earlier abandonment of the ships or more adaptive travel strategies might have improved chances. By 1854, the British public still held faint hope that survivors might be found. However, Rae acquired definitive evidence from Inuit communities, indicating that no living members remained. In 1857, the British Parliament declared the expedition lost. In 1860, Franklin was officially recognized posthumously as having completed the Northwest Passage, though his crew never navigated it in full. This designation was made based on connecting locations reached by earlier and later voyages, and was symbolic, aimed at honoring the men who perished. Today, the Franklin expedition is remembered as one of the most tragic yet influential episodes in the history of polar exploration. Modern DNA analysis has enabled identification of some crew remains. The expedition has prompted discussions regarding naval planning, survival training, and adaptive leadership under extreme conditions. The failed retreat across King William Island and toward the Back River remains one of the most well-documented examples of polar expedition collapse, marked by underestimation of natural conditions, over-reliance on untested technology, and inflexible strategic parameters. As of today, international teams continue investigations into remaining wrecks and land sites, using advanced imaging and conservation techniques. Both wrecks are now protected sites under Canadian jurisdiction. The area is recognized as a historically sensitive zone, with limited excavation permitted to preserve structural integrity. Ongoing studies aim to determine daily life aboard the ships and provide clearer insight into decision-making during the final phases of the expedition. This moment concludes the phase of escape attempt and describes the gradual disappearance of the crew. It composes the central collapse phase in this documentary narrative. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If this expedition moved you, and you believe more people should learn about these forgotten chapters of history, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and bring new expeditions to light.